Hello, everyone. Welcome back to this episode of Leading Through Unprecedented Times. Here we are, episode 4 of season 7, and I am fired up for today's guest. I have to say, full disclosure, he does happen to be one of my best friends, but also one of the most brilliant educators that I get to learn from daily. It is the one and only Ken Shelton. Ken's an author, a speaker, one of our Future Ready faculty members, and we are so proud to have a little bit of his time today because he is on the move. He is on the road working with District Side by Side, and what a fun podcast this is going to be. Ken, how you doing, my friend?
I'm doing good, and I love that intro, and I think for our audience, I'm glad you shared that, you and I are BFFs. So basically, for those of you listening, this is kind of like a conversation between two best friends that we're including you in. And what's interesting, I think, to point out is that we're recording this one, but this conversation is pretty much consistent with many of the conversations you and I have in general, whether it's over dinner or on the phone or to share with her. My favorite, because both Tom and I travel a lot for work, one of the things that we do to check in on each other is we'll text and we'll say, hey, I'm going to be driving for the next 3 hours. Call me if you're available. So I'm glad we're able to actually take the time to record one of our conversations so that we can share our thoughts and such with an audience. So it's a privilege to be here. And for those of you listening in, I'm glad you could be a part of what our normal conversations that both Tom and I have.
Absolutely. It's part of the reason I'm so fired up. And Ken, you're going to laugh because Ken and I have shared the stage many a times. And I like our opening line where I get to share, one of us has been a Division I football player. One of us has also been a professional model. And I'm neither one of those. I'm Tom Murray, and I'm your host for this episode of the podcast. Ken, for those of you that, for those few people that might not be familiar with your work, just a really quick overview, just your trajectory into the work you do today.
Yeah, so no, I appreciate that, and full disclosure, I did play college football, but I didn't get a lot of playing time, so that's probably why I'm not broken up now. But at any rate, and ideally, I do still do some modeling work. So as long as I can maintain, the marketable smile, I'm going to keep rolling with that. So for those of you that are listening that don't know me, I'm based in Los Angeles. I taught in the Los Angeles Unified School District for just over 2 decades. And my subject matters were English, social studies, and then in a technology lab. So I have those 3 certifications. I also have a master's degree in design, and I've been a big ed tech advocate as well as user pretty much this entire century, but also it preceded my time in education. And I have the fortunate privilege now of being able to travel the country and the world to give keynotes, provide consulting services, professional development services, among many other things and many other hats that I wear, doing work that ideally is impactful, but then also simultaneously brings me joy.
Ken, one of the reasons I asked you to be on the podcast, besides everything that we've already shared, there's this new phrase I've been hearing out there recently. It was called artificial intelligence or something. I'm not sure if you've heard of it yet, right? Right? Like, it's all the rage everywhere we go. We were just at a conference together last month in New York, and you title a session right now at a conference like AI something, and it is packed. I type it like, hey, we're going to do a session on shifting pedagogy, and there's 4 people sitting in the front row, right? Part of our problem, but let's be real, everybody's talking about it. School boards are talking about it. Leaders are talking about it. And I want to give a shout out to one of the best books of 2024 into here 2025, and that's called The Promise and Perils of AI in Education by the one and only Ken Shelton and another good friend, Dee Lanier. Incredible authors, but speakers, but I continue to learn as I go back through this book. And what I love about this book is I also love the subtitle that ethics and equity have entered the chat. And what an important piece. It's so different than the other AI books that have been put out there that I've also read, and just incredible text that I'm excited to dive into today. Ken, talk to us about, for our school and district leaders, our superintendents, our principals, maybe our librarians, those folks that are here, talk to us. You get to see on a national scale. So many of our listeners, maybe they're familiar with things in their region. They're doing things at the BOCES level in New York or those kinds of things, wherever they're from. You get to see it in national landscape. Reflect, if you would, on the past, like really 2 years, right? And we all know that AI is much older than that, right? But
Right.
since that release of ChatGPT, the explosion that we've seen, one of the things that I love is you keep it real, right? We're not here to say we all got to jump on that bandwagon. We got to keep it where we're going to dive into what are some things districts really need to be careful of, and how are they developing some of these policies. And so, great conversation. Ken, what are you seeing across the country in the last 6 months, 12 months, 2 years? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So one, going back to the book, back in November, we also released a companion guide to the book. So, if folks know of the book but not the companion guide, then we need to do a better job of promoting it. But the whole idea around the companion guide is if you decide to do a book study, the companion guide, the design of it essentially was, with myself and Dee, my co-author, was if we know folks are going to do a book study and we can't physically be in the room with them for the book study, then let's create something that kind of puts us in the room and allows to process your thinking and put your thinking from the book into tangible action items around activities as well as next steps. So yeah, I mean, like you said, it's the new, quote unquote, the new thing, and there's a reason why in the introduction to the book, I referenced one of my favorite songs from one of my favorite bands growing up, which is The Who. And the song is Won't Get Fooled Again. When there's a line towards the end of towards the end of the song called, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. So the reason why I share that in that intro and I share it now is it is the rage and it is very popular. And I always say educators have a degree of a short attention span that can serve us well in the classroom, but also can hamper our professional growth because we're constantly gravitating towards this new thing, and it's accelerated with tech. And so AI is not technically new as a technology. It's been around for quite some time. In fact, the earliest things I've seen that represent AI is back in 1955. But what is new is generative AI and its accessibility to the masses. And that occurred starting off more or less in November of 2022. And so, yes, like you said, there's the idea of, it's this new thing. I need to learn about it. Is it cool? What are the things I need to know? But also what's happening in that context is this hasteful approach there. This hasteful approach to, well, I need to know it, I need to use it, we need to do it now. And unfortunately, that has permeated the consciousness of leaders as well, to where, they're buying platforms without providing or without giving it the degree of scrutiny or the vetting process that it actually should have. Teachers are using it because there is the promise of it will save you time or you can automate certain things. And my approach in general has always been like it is with any other technology. Let's get a deep understanding of it, and then let's start asking some questions, because I'm not opposed to it, but I'm also not approaching it from the terminology I like to use in my workshops is I'm not approaching it with a degree of fanfare where I'm throwing up confetti and blowing kazoos. And you've seen how over the last 2 years how the acceleration of the development of AI platforms. In fact, here's one for the audience. So one is you think about how fast different versions of AI, generative AI platforms have evolved in the last 2 years. One of the questions I love to pose is how many AI companies, big companies, how many companies have AI platforms globally? And what usually shocks people is they're like, oh, it's hundreds. I'm like, no, it's only 8, actually. And of those 8, 5 of them are based in the US and 3 of them are based in China. And so one, that should already give you pause that there you don't have the degree of diversity with respect to where these companies are located and how many of them are developing platforms. So outside of those 8, everything else is a derivative of that. So that's number one. Number two is the constant overpromise of what it can do to support educators with respect to things, again, like automate certain things, save you time. And sometimes when we approach those things, and look, I understand why there's an allure for that, because One of the things that you'll find with educators is we never have enough time to do what we really want to do, nor do we ever have enough financial resources to do what what the things that we would like to do. And so my point being is that that's where you're getting all of this allure. And unfortunately, let's just put it this way, you can either walk through a minefield and still make progress and not step on a mine, or you can sprint through a minefield and run the risk of stepping on a mine. Now, which approach do we think is going to be more practical and more safe?
Yeah. And it's exactly why at All for Ed, our process has been very intentional, not hopping right in and looking in and wow, we just did a lot of damage, but being really intentional, really evidence-based, and working with people like you to really make sure that we're not having, we're very conscious of blind spots that others may be missing. So with that, there's so much fear out there around AI on one hand. On the other hand, there's good reason to pause, right? What I want to do though is I actually want to hit pause for a moment. You had mentioned generative AI. You had mentioned how AI has been around for a long time. Maybe I'm somebody listening here being like, what are all these different types of AI? How is AI, like generative AI, different than the others? Can you just take a moment or two, break down a couple of different types of AI and like what's actually different about them? I think that'd be helpful.
Brilliant. And thank you for asking that. So, two things. This is why we have the subtitle of our book, Ethics and Equity Have Entered the Chat, because those need to be foundational to our conversations. And also adding to that is what I describe in my talks and my workshops is you have to have or develop a systems thinking approach. Artificial intelligence is essentially a catch-all term for a type of technology. And what I always say is when people say, well, we need to use artificial intelligence, ideally you follow up with, okay, great, but what kind? It would be like me saying, I need to get from point A to point B and I'm going to use a vehicle. Well, you see what I'm saying there. So that's why I'm glad you asked this question. So for the audience, systems thinking approach should be the driver for what type of AI system you want to utilize and for what specific purpose. There are generally three different types of AI systems. There is reactive, predictive, and generative. So to explain it in the simplest of terms, your reactive AI systems are things like your voice assistants. They react to a specific input. You have a specific input to get a specific output. More often than not, that data that provides that output is both labeled and supervised. Good response, bad response, and then, or even in some cases, if it's a good response, but there's a better option, then that data is modified to provide the better response. But it gives you it's limited input and limited output. So, for example, you can't go to your voice assistant and say, I'm a classroom educator that teaches 8th grade English language arts, and I want to do a 4-week lesson plan on descriptive writing that incorporates elements of, of technology or transportation. Like it won't do that because it's not in data sets. So then your predictive artificial intelligence systems are things like your subscription models, like your Netflix, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, Hulu. They based on your listening or viewing patterns, it predicts what you're likely to want to consume next. So the example I always love to share is if I watch a lot of sports documentaries on Netflix, it's going to start recommending documentaries. It won't only recommend sports documentaries because it's too specific, but it will recommend documentaries because that's the genre. My other favorite example is, my opinion is one of the greatest musicians to ever have lived that I grew up consuming his music significantly. It was Prince. So I listen to a lot of Prince. So Spotify is going to recommend more 80s music that is not limited to just Prince because it goes based on the genre. Generative is completely different. Generative uses historical patterns to make predictions. And so my favorite example I share is if I start off a sentence with once upon a, and then I ask folks to fill in the blank, pretty much everybody says time. And I said, that is exactly how generative systems work. Is time 100% the answer? No, because it could be midnight dreary. But you are using a historical pattern to make a prediction. And that is how generative artificial intelligence works. It cannot create something new. As newer patterns emerge based on that historical data, it then learns those new patterns. But in the end, it doesn't create something new. And this is where it's important to develop not only a comprehensive AI literacy approach to how we use these systems, but again, I just described three completely different types of artificial intelligence. And this is where going at it with a degree of pragmatic and judicious vetting as well as analysis is why it's important to understand how these systems work, because in many cases, the systems may run counter to the educational goals that a leader or a teacher has for the students.
So let's dive into problems when we take history and we scale it up and we automate it, and issues that might happen. And so part of my fear when we think about when we take data sets that, let's recognize, part of our personal conversations all the time is some
Yeah.
issues with patterns of the past. And we take those issues with patterns of the past. Now we automate them. We scale those issues. We just amplified significant issues that we've had throughout the history of our country, have we not? And so,
Right.
what are some of the things that, when we think about some of the things districts really need to look hard in? Like one of the things people are talking about, bias, right? Something you talk about, the chapter in your book on bias. Like if I'm an educator thinking, all right, I want to look at some AI systems, like where do I begin with the bias conversation? What does that look like? Talk to us about some of those things that districts really need to be looking at, training people on, asking some good questions to vendors that need to be had. Talk to us about some of the things that that you see out there that we really need to be asking questions about and ensuring are really well aligned, so that we're not harming those that are using it.
Yeah, let's work that in three areas. So start off number one, the bias thing. So uh, hopefully, folks that are listening have sat through sessions where they don't. And unfortunately, I see this more often than I should, and that is a kind of like the equivalent of what I say, a throwaway comment. Oh, it has bias. Now let's move on. Or another one is when you use an LLM and you type in a prompt, check for the bias, and then now they move on. And I have my personal opinions about that, but for the audience, it's important to recognize that you cannot just take that as a throwaway comment. The bias is there and it is real. And so the first thing to do is to honestly, which is probably the most difficult, but this is how I roll. You got to check your own biases and you got to ask yourself, for example, one of my favorite activities to do is I go to an image generator and I say, I'm going to ask it to generate an image of a doctor. So before I type that in, what do you think it's going to generate? And I have the audience tell me. And more often than not, they're correct. And I go, see, that right there is exactly why you got to be consciously aware of your own biases. What you think it's going to do is more often than not exactly what it's going to do. It's not some hidden technology that's this black box that we have no control over, or it's some sort of sentient being that can do its own thing. That's not the way it works. And so the first step is to ask yourself the questions around what are the biases that are normalized in my stream of thought or my stream of consciousness. If you take it into education, one of the things that I did was I did it with a group recently where I said, I'm going to have it generate an image of a gifted student. What do you think that's going to do? And they did it. And I'm like, now here's a question before I have it do it. Why is that the image that you think? Well, one, because that's the historical pattern that the audience had been exposed to. And I'm like, that is the data that's in the systems, period. Now, there are ways to reduce that, which I can talk about in just a moment. So that's the first one, is to recognize that we all carry biases. By the way, not all of them are bad, but we also need to recognize what are the things that I can predict will likely occur based on this input. And is that me reinforcing a bias of myself? And because if I'm aware of my own bias for that input, that's part of the process to reduce the likelihood of it appearing in the results. So that's number one. The second layer is when it comes to schools in general is I always pose the question, if you're looking at incorporating, implementing, or integrating some sort of AI system, whatever that system may be, what is the simplest solution to the problem you're trying to solve that the humans cannot solve themselves? And then now look at your historical data, whether it be enrollment in certain classes or the allocation of certain resources, the labeling of students, whether they be labeled as highly gifted or qualify for diverse learner resources and support. Whatever that pattern has been, an AI system is only going to replicate that. And then the bigger thing is to start to carry that with you into the conversations with the vendors that I always share with superintendents is you want to have a comprehensive vetting process. That, like, first of all, asking them what are the data sets that they're using, and if they can't answer that, I would not write them a check. Okay, and they need to be transparent on that. Then what are and here's the key words: what are their data governance practices? Okay, how are they acquiring the data they're using? The third one is what's needed to utilize your platform. So in other words, does it require me to log in, for example, with my email address? Because if it does, then I'm going to ask, are you storing my email address? If you are, for how long? Why do you need my email address in order for your platform to work? And then we're going to get into more of the technical stuff. Does my use of your platform also train your platform? And then the last one is, which comes up all the time, and I see it all the time in terms of service that I encourage. When I point it out, I say to leaders, I'm like, this is one question I for sure would scrutinize very heavily, is many terms of service have it where they can change components of the platform and they don't have to inform you that they're doing that.
Yeah.
And you see, those are the things that's why I start off the individual, then school, then system. Those are the things that I encourage leaders to ask, because you don't have to buy what they're selling. If we think about it from this standpoint, and I bring this up, in fact, you and I brought this up in the workshop, one of the workshops we do around humanizing AI. If we all collectively start posing those questions, regardless of whether there's any degree of regulations or accountability on these developers, we can take ownership of that by saying, if you don't provide transparency around these things, then we're not going to buy what you're selling. And if more and more of us do this, then guess what's going to happen? They're going to have to do it, because it's only a matter of time before something goes sideways and somebody actually gets hurt, whether it be a district getting hurt through litigation or an individual getting hurt through any one of a myriad of things.
Yeah, Ken, I want to go back to something you just said and ask a follow-up, because I'm guessing some of our listeners might have been thinking, like, tell me more. You made the comment about, is the system using my data, my information, my inputs to train the system? Tell us more about that, and why is that something they should be conscious of?
So that kind of connects to the whole idea around automation. So again, let's go back to my description of generative AI systems. They work based on historical patterns. As new patterns emerge, those become part of the system for the predictions that it makes. So let me here, I'll try to explain it in as simplistic a terms as I can. So let's say that a historical pattern is 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's going to predict that now there's 5. That's one pattern. And then now all of a sudden a new pattern emerges that goes 1, 3, 5. Okay, so now that's 2 different historical patterns. The question around the training of the data is, where is it getting that new pattern from? Is it from our usage? Or is it from its current data sets and then its continued development of adding to its data set? So in other words, a generative AI platform is only as powerful and effective as how much data it has. This is why they need data. And this is why we really got to get into the ethical. This is why I said data governance. We got to get into the ethical acquisition and then usage of data. So nobody's going to build a platform from scratch at this point. If they tell you they built it from scratch, they're lying, because no one's going to do it. Think about, you have to have massive amounts of data for these platforms to work. The question is, when you have X amount of data, that means that your platform can only perform there's going to be a cap at to which it can perform. In some cases, that data is poorly trained. Okay. In order to get better trained data, you got to get more data. Well, where is it getting that data from? And I say that because for me, I'm an advocate for insisting on transparency around data governance. Not all data collection is bad. So for example, there are many platforms that we use in education that they've looked at the usage patterns and such, and that information has led to improvements and features on the platforms themselves. So let me be clear, it's not all bad. But when it comes to things like generative AI, because data is the most valuable thing that it has, there should be a higher degree of transparency. I should know, if I'm a superintendent, if I write a check for your platform, are you taking our usage to train your model? Because then that should require additional questions like, well, if I'm paying you for this and you're taking what we're doing to improve it, then you're actually going to monetize something that at a minimum, I should be aware of that at a minimum. But I think more importantly for decision makers, that should lead to a decision like, well, then why am I writing you a check? And this is where I caution folks around things like, and Dee and I mentioned this in the book, if the platform is free, then there's a high probability that you are the product. And you think about where we are in technology, and as far as especially artificial intelligence, data data is more valuable than your money, because the data is how you part with your money. And that's why it's important to start asking those questions around that, around what's training the models.
Yeah. And I loved your pause after the you are the product, because I'm sure some folks pause thinking like, wait, I haven't necessarily thought about it that way, but you're so spot on in your thinking with that. You're somebody, Ken, that's going around the country, heck, around the world, and you do professional learning on these conversations on AI. So if I'm a district that's saying we need to be having conversations like this, what does effective professional learning look like in school districts around AI? From your lens, like where do they start? What are the types of things that they need to be talking about? Just quickly on some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things on that. So one of the questions that Dee and I pose all the time in our workshops, both dependently together and independently, is efficiency versus efficacy. Are we asking the right questions? This gravitation towards efficiency runs a greater risk of being counter to both equity and personalization. Like make it make sense for me. You can't simultaneously say our focus is on efficiency, but then also say that you embrace personalized learning. It doesn't work that way. The other thing is automation. Automating ineffective practices will not improve outcomes. I've seen it where there are certain platforms that pitch things like type in a simple one sentence prompt and it'll generate an entire unit worth of worksheets. Well, that assumes that worksheets are effective pedagogical practice. And, for most of us, we know not really. I mean, I won't throw out worksheets entirely because I just don't believe in doing that necessarily. But if that's your overpromise, then we need to have a conversation about that. But the main thing here is for listeners is to ask the question, the simplest of question. In fact, you and I pose this in our workshops together. Again, is what problem are you looking for AI to solve that the humans cannot solve themselves? I mean, my favorite questions is that's number one. Let's start off with just that, because before I get to AI, I need to know what is a problem, what is a gap we're looking to fill, the problem we're looking to solve. And if we can't do it ourselves, then now how can artificial intelligence do it? And then this goes back to my explanation. What specific AI system allows us to do that? Okay. Common thing that comes up all the time, and I agree with it, is increasing the effectiveness of feedback. Now, there are ways to leverage an AI system for at least providing more timely, responsive, and personalized feedback. But again, you got to know what are the systems that exist and which one specifically allows me to do that in a way that that empowers both the learners and the educators. I provide a comprehensive professional development support to do that. And then most importantly, acquiring that platform in alignment with the educational goals that we have, whether they're delineated in the strategic plan or the core mission of the district or the school system itself. But that those are the things that occur before you decide which platform to use. And then, of course, the PD has to really be, it has to be both responsive and personalized. So in other words, PD using an AI platform for example, a mathematics department should be different than for an English language arts department. And then I'm going to add one more last thing to it, is there really, really, really needs to be much, much more time and care given to the conversation around academic integrity. I often see the constant labeling of cheating and plagiarism all the time. And for me, I don't even get into an argument as to whether or not using AI is cheating and plagiarism. I just say, before we get into our opinions, let's go with the objective facts. And the objective fact is that using an artificial intelligence system is not legally plagiarism. And I show people the legal definition of plagiarism. And by the way, I've done this in other countries as well. And the definitions are pretty much all consistent. Okay, so it's not that. Then we can get into the whole idea around cheating. And what often comes up with cheating is a definitions that involve any sort of derivative of rules or fairness. And I'm like, but rules are humanly constructed and fairness is subjective. And again, the whole idea is we really need to have the conversation around if you can't cleanly define these things, then is it fair to just haphazardly label things cheating or plagiarism? And then we need to address the disease, not the symptom. Something that is labeled as cheating, I often say, is that's a symptom. There's something else going on that would lead a learner to say, I'm going to take steps to circumvent my learning by, for example, having it write my paper for me. My thing is, okay, fine, but then I need to know what resource supports were available that you weren't aware of, or what resource supports aren't available that you need, that you are consciously saying, I'm okay with not learning this and having that do it for me.
Yeah, such important pieces. And you beat me to the academic integrity because I heard you talk about it when we were at the NICE conference together, and I really enjoyed listening. To give me another stream of thought, is tutoring cheating? Is a parent at
Right.
home helping a child cheating? Is
Correct.
spell check cheating? Right. And so many of these things we really have to look at, like get to the heart of the issue and the purpose behind even some of the questions related to that as well. Love listening to hear you talk about that. One final question. I know we're tight on time. Districts are having lots of conversations around policies and creating policies. Just give me one recommendation that you have as they're having that conversation. One recommendation besides all the other pieces that you've already shared. What's something they need to be thinking about when it comes to creating policies around AI?
I mean, my first thing is that a policy should provide guidance and support, not be what often happens, unfortunately, in education is provide a punitive response. Okay. So guidance and support, number one. Number two, the policy needs to be dynamic. Okay. If it's dynamic and guidance and support, then you're not going to constantly be updating it every 2 or 3 months. Okay. I certainly encourage folks to really start to prioritize conversations around ethics and responsible use. Don't just haphazardly throw it into your digital citizenship bucket. I mean, there's more to it than just that. And that conversation needs to occur with learners and with educators. And I'll give you a quick side note example. I cringe when I hear well, the kids they can't use AI. But we want the teachers to use it to do all the following things. You see, like even that right there, I'm not you can't tell a child, no, you can't do it. But then simultaneously a teacher, yes, you can do it. In fact, we want you to do it to automate, fill in the blank. Okay. So the conversation needs to occur, and it deserves a higher degree of care and grace because learning is not static; it's dynamic, and we need to have policies that reinforce those things. And my other encouragement is to not gravitate towards the very cute and oversimplified graphics that I'm seeing put out all the time, where, for example, there's a red light, yellow light, and a green light, or some sort of stop, wait, or go example. If that's your starting point, fine. I'm not opposed to that, but don't let that be both the start and the end point, because learning is dynamic. And we cannot oversimplify or compartmentalize our usage of really technology in general, but obviously in the context of our conversation, artificial intelligence. So those are some of the main things I would say around policy. And then of course, you also want to have a comprehensive implementation strategy, which means it's not just the PD, it's also involving the community in understanding artificial intelligence and how you're using it, students understanding it and how they're using it, and how it serves as what I always describe as it should serve as another digital resource, not a talking point that requires binary thinking, like we're either all in or we're all out. It's another digital resource, but we also need to approach it with the right degree of care and attention to avoid the potential harms that it could cause, but also leverage it in ways that can, be another supportive mechanism towards empowering learners. And what I always say is, how do we look at it where we can use AI for good to dismantle barriers?
Yeah. Ken, I always appreciate the depth of your thoughts, the multifaceted approach you take, really trying to look at all angles there. One final question for you. I always love to wrap up the podcast with this question. No matter who's listening, whether they're a superintendent, maybe they're knee deep in this stuff, working, navigating it. Maybe you're saying, hey, we know we need to get some things going in terms of policies and really making sure that our practices align with those pieces. What's one piece of advice, no matter their role, no matter where they are in any sort of implementation, one piece of advice you have from educators all across the board when it comes to AI?
100%, no, without question. Always do it from a learner-centered approach. period. Like, again, I mean, the question, what is the simplest solution that the humans cannot solve that we need AI to help us solve? And how does that empower learners, empower educators? Again, it's not the analogy I use is you don't want to purchase or use AI, and the metaphor I use is like a hammer that's looking for a nail. Now we need to analyze what is our current learning experiences we want learners to have. What are the important components to our strategic plan? Now, what are the parts of that we cannot fully actualize ourselves? And then now, how might AI fit into a comprehensive and robust solution? That's where I would start before you get into, writing the big check for, fill in a blank platform and stuff.
Well, everybody, that is the one and only Ken Shelton. Ken, thank you for your support of Future Ready Schools constantly. Thank you for the work that you're doing from coast to coast. I applaud you, my brother. I appreciate you. Thank you for helping me personally grow and in so many different ways. You are loved and you are appreciated across the board. So, Ken, thank you so much for being with us today. We will tune in next week and see everyone soon. On behalf of All for Ed's Future Ready Schools, thanks for your work each and every day.
Thank you.